Emmerdale's upcoming week from 21st to the 25th of July 2025 teases that the village's summer mood will be filled with grief, secrets, betrayal and shaky loyalties, as the events of late July unfold. A peaceful start to the week is turned upside down by the excruciating pain of a huge loss and the harsh truths that follow. John was never one to wear his heart on his sleeve, but Nate's death fractured something deep inside him. The police had closed the case quickly, too quickly. The official line: the suspect committed suicide, taking with them any hope of resolution. But John knew better. Or at least, he thought he did. In his mind, there was one man responsible: Owen. The mere thought of Owen's smug face in the days following the tragedy drove John mad. He didn't have proof, but he didn't need it. He had instinct, anger, and a growing determination to expose the truth as he saw it. John's plan wasn't just about revenge, it was theater. He crafted every word, every meeting, every moment, hoping Cain would see the logic, would see what he saw, and maybe, just maybe, find a sliver of solace in holding someone accountable. But Cain wasn't buying it. Instead, he was enraged. He wasn't looking for a scapegoat, he wanted answers. Real answers. And Owen's death had robbed him of that. Now, Cain's grief had turned to fury, and much of it was aimed at John, who'd made the mistake of offering explanations without evidence. John's nights grew restless. Sleep eluded him. Shadows danced on his walls, and Nate's voice haunted his thoughts. With Cain's wrath looming and the village beginning to whisper about his obsession, John found himself spiraling. He couldn't tell reality from fear anymore. In desperation, he turned to someone unknown, someone outside the village, someone who promised clarity. But what this stranger would offer would come with a price, and John's already shaky moral compass would be tested further than he ever imagined. Elsewhere, another storm brewed. Moira, already reeling from Nate's death, faced a threat of a different kind. The letter from the water company hit like a sledgehammer. Her appeal had been denied. Without access to reliable irrigation, Butler's farm was on the brink. Crops were dying, and the land was turning against her. Then came Kim. Sleek, poised, and predatory, Kim delivered her proposal with a cold kind of elegance. She wanted Butler's farm. Not as a friend. Not out of pity. But as part of a much bigger scheme. Moira saw it immediately: there was more to this than a struggling piece of land. And Kim wasn't one to make sentimental investments. Cain's support, though unexpected, was firm. He knew what the farm meant to Moira, to their shared past. But even his backing couldn't slow the tide of pressure Kim had begun to unleash. What Moira didn't know was that the battle for the farm was already being waged behind her back. Robert had quietly begun negotiations with Kim concerning Annie's field, a piece of land bordering Butler's farm, believing it to be a solution to Moira's growing troubles. But the deal had strings, many of them invisible. Kim was clear with Joe: no one could suspect the real reasons she wanted control of the area. Joe executed her vision with precision, playing the sympathetic outsider, suggesting once again that Moira consider Kim's offer. But Robert began noticing inconsistencies: Kim's eagerness, Joe's subtle pressure, the strategic timing of the water company's rejection. It all felt too convenient. And Robert didn't trust convenience. When he refused to sign the final documents, citing second thoughts, Kim's temper flared beneath her carefully composed smile. Robert began investigating, talking to land surveyors, searching records. What he found unsettled him. A development proposal filed months before the water appeal was even denied. There was more at stake than just farmland. Someone had plans to reshape part of Emmerdale, and it began with Butler's farm. Meanwhile, emotional tensions ran high in the Dingle household. Charity, driven by her deep love for Sarah, made a decision that sent ripples through her marriage. She agreed to be Sarah's surrogate. It should have been a moment of unity, a testament to maternal love. But for Mackenzie, it was a betrayal. If Charity could carry Sarah's child, why not his? The argument was swift and raw. Mackenzie accused her of double standards, of choosing Sarah's future over their own. Charity, ever defiant, held her ground. She explained that this wasn't about biology, it was about saving Sarah. But Mackenzie couldn't let go of the sting. He stormed out, and that's when Eric, of all people, stepped in. Pollard had his own concerns, not about the baby, but about the cost. Not financial, but emotional. He saw Jacob falling deeper into anger, alienating himself from those who loved him. Pollard warned him, rage wouldn't heal anything. Jacob, defensive and wounded, lashed out. He accused Pollard of meddling, of trying to sabotage his connection to Sarah. But the old man stood firm. It wasn't Sarah he worried about. It was what the future would look like once the honeymoon period of hope gave way to medical risks and heartbreak. Sarah, too, picked up on the growing discontent. She confronted Pollard, accusing him of judging Charity. But what he said caught her off guard. He wasn't worried about Charity's decision, he was terrified of Sarah's mortality. She didn't want to hear it, but deep down, she knew he was right. Her body had already been through too much. The chances weren't in her favor, and if something happened to Charity in the process, could she live with that? Still, Charity pressed forward. She scheduled the first appointment at the fertility clinic, only to find out they'd already begun prepping her for artificial insemination. She hadn't authorized it. Someone had pushed the timeline. Was it Sarah? Or worse, someone else entirely? The breach of trust left her shaken. Back in the quieter corners of the village, April sat at Take a Vow, laughing with Belle over floral arrangements and wedding chaos. It wasn't glamorous work, but she loved it. Belle treated her like an equal, not a child, and for the first time, April felt like she had a purpose beyond school. But Marlon wasn't amused. He saw her skipping classes and feared she was throwing away her education. When he confronted her, their conversation turned sour. April declared she had a plan, that school wasn't the only path. Marlon, overwhelmed by grief and protective instinct, refused to listen. 4 days they didn't speak. In a house already clouded by Nate's absence, the silence grew louder than any argument. Belle tried to mediate, encouraging Marlon to listen rather than lecture. But the divide was deepening. April was on the edge of independence, and Marlon couldn't let go. Each thread of the story tangled with the next: land battles, grief, betrayal, ambition, and quiet rebellion, shaping Emmerdale into a village bracing for its next reckoning. The quiet tension that clung to Emmerdale began to twist into open confrontation as the days wore on. John, still reeling from Kane's reaction and haunted by his own misgivings, started slipping further into paranoia. The stranger he had reached out to, a man who claimed to be a private investigator, began to show more interest in John's vulnerabilities than in Nate's death. What began as a quest for answers transformed into manipulation, as the stranger demanded money for further investigation and subtly threatened to release information if John didn't comply. Terrified that he had made a mistake in trusting a complete outsider, John found himself trapped. He considered going to Kane with what he knew, or thought he knew, but the fear of Kane's fury held him back. Every word he had once spoken to convince Kane of Owen's guilt now echoed in his ears as potential lies. Did he actually believe Owen was responsible? Or had his grief pushed him into creating an enemy to make sense of a senseless death? Moira, meanwhile, found herself facing the limits of resilience. Kane's support gave her strength, but as the financial noose tightened, her options dwindled. Kim's proposition became harder to ignore. Joe continued to press the matter under the guise of concern, frequently reminding Moira that rejection could result in foreclosure. He presented it as a chance to step back, to let someone else handle the burdens. But Moira's instincts screamed otherwise. When Moira overheard a hushed conversation between Joe and Kim about expansion and surveyors, everything clicked into place. This wasn't about saving the farm, it was about something bigger. Kim was planning a development project. The farmland was key, not because of its current value, but because of what it could become. Moira knew then that selling to Kim would mean the erasure of Butler's legacy. Her decision solidified the next day, when she discovered a surveyor's drone flying over her property. She confronted Joe, who brushed it off as a routine environmental inspection, but the lie was transparent. With Kane at her side, she made it clear, they wouldn't sell. Not now. Not ever. But Kim wasn't known for accepting refusals. That night, Moira received a call from her bank. An anonymous report had flagged her for financial irregularities. Someone was tightening the screws. Kim, unfazed by setbacks, regrouped. She visited Robert, this time not with charm, but with veiled threats. If he wouldn't sign, she'd find someone who would. Robert, increasingly suspicious, decided to speak with the water board directly. What he learned shocked him. The rejection of Moira's appeal had occurred under strange circumstances. The local official, who had handled the case, had suddenly resigned after approving Kim's private land development application. Robert now had proof that Kim had been playing a longer, more calculated game. He brought it to Moira, who was stunned but not surprised. Together, they began to chart a counterattack. Kane proposed reaching out to an investigative journalist he once knew, someone who could bring the shady dealings into public light. But going public came with risks, especially with Kim involved. Tension wasn't limited to the land. Charity's unease grew as she realized how quickly the clinic had moved with the insemination process. It was Sarah who confessed. Tearfully, she admitted to signing the authorization under Charity's name. She had been terrified the opportunity would pass and made a desperate decision. Charity was torn, anger at the breach, sorrow at Sarah's desperation. Mackenzie, upon hearing the truth, was quiet. For once, he didn't argue. But the silence was worse than shouting. Eric Pollard stepped in with his usual directness, confronting Mac about his priorities. He urged him to support Charity, not punish her. The child was coming, and if the family was to weather the storm, Mac needed to put aside his pride. It struck a chord. That evening, Mac returned home, not with forgiveness, but with a promise, he would stand by Charity. But they would need to rebuild trust brick by brick. Jacob, meanwhile, wasn't done lashing out. Convinced that Pollard was undermining Sarah, and that everyone was treating him like a child, he made a rash decision. He proposed moving away with Sarah after the baby was born. Sarah, startled, pushed back. She reminded Jacob that the future was uncertain. Her health, the baby, their finances, none of it was stable. She loved him, but she wasn't ready to abandon her family. Jacob stormed off, his anger now tinged with heartbreak. At Take a Vow, Belle tried to shield April from the rising conflict in her home. The young girl, for all her maturity, was still vulnerable. Belle offered more responsibilities, praising her eye for detail and her quick thinking. April flourished, but the more she grew into the job, the further she drifted from school. When Marlon attempted another sit-down, April was curt. She had drafted a proposal to take on a formal apprenticeship with Belle. It wasn't just a whim, she had plans, goals, timelines. Marlon read the document and realized, with some shock, how serious she was. He didn't agree, but for the first time, he saw her as someone who had a clear vision. He asked for time to think. "Belle, torn between loyalty to Marlon and her belief in April's potential, stayed silent. But her silence was complicity. When Marlon later confronted her, their discussion became heated. Belle insisted she wasn't encouraging April to skip school, but she admitted the girl had talent. Marlon felt cornered. The pain of losing Nate had made him desperate to protect what remained of his family. Letting April grow up felt like letting go. One evening, April returned home to find Marlon sitting quietly, holding one of Nate's old schoolbooks. He offered it to her without a word. She opened it, and inside was a note Nate had once scribbled to himself: "Don't let anyone decide your path. Find it, or make it." April burst into tears. It wasn't an answer, but it was the first step toward a truce. Meanwhile, the village buzzed with rumors. People whispered about John's erratic behavior, about the stranger seen lingering near the pub. Moira's troubles weren't secret anymore, and speculation ran wild about Kim's next move. But the biggest shift came when Robert received a letter from an anonymous source. It contained internal memos from Kim's company, emails, contracts, records of meetings. Someone on the inside was feeding them intel. Robert suspected Joe. The timing was too precise. Confronting him, Robert offered a deal: testify against Kim and walk away clean. Joe didn't answer, but his eyes betrayed a storm of doubt. Kim had promised him power. But now, the walls were closing in. That night, Joe stood alone outside Butler's farm, staring at the land he had once viewed as a pawn. He lit a cigarette, but the lighter trembled in his hand. In the shadows, John watched from his car, eyes darting, mind racing. Something big was coming. He could feel it. He just didn't know if he'd survive it. And somewhere, beyond Emmerdale's borders, the stranger smiled. His work in the village wasn't done. In fact, it had only just begun.